At 50, David Beckham stands before the world as a living summary of more than 3 decades of elite football. He was part of the Manchester United generation that achieved the historic treble in 1999, winning 6 Premier League titles, 2 FA Cups, and the Champions League titles that placed him at the center of English football's golden era. He wore the Real Madrid jersey during the Galácticos period, winning La Liga and becoming a global face that extended far beyond the pitch. He moved to the United States when few believed MLS could become a destination for major stars, then led LA Galaxy to 2 MLS Cup championships, opening a new chapter for football in North America. With over 100 caps for the England national team and many years as captain, Beckham was not just a player, but a national icon. He was awarded the OBE by the British royal family, became the face of numerous sports and humanitarian campaigns, and after retirement continued to leave his mark as co-owner of Inter Miami, helping reshape the landscape of American soccer. From the outside, it looks like an almost perfect journey, where trophies, spotlights, and admiration followed one another without pause. But when the glare fades, Beckham is left alone with a body that has paid the full price for each of those achievements. Mornings begin with a dull ache in his back, knees stiffening after short sleep, and a fatigue he can't show in public. He carries the memory of a young man once turned against by his entire country in a single moment, of years lived under the pressure to be perfect, never allowed to fail, never allowed to show weakness. Beckham learned endurance early, enduring the expectations of family, club, nation, and later, the whole world. His willpower isn't explosive. It's a cold persistence, the ability to rise quietly, to keep training when no one is clapping, to maintain discipline even when his body rebels. Some tragedies don't come from failure, but from never being allowed to fall. At 50, Beckham has no place left to hide from those memories, but he no longer runs. He walks slowly, carrying the pain as part of himself, living on with the calm of a man who understands that glory may pass, but what it leaves in the body and soul lingers for a very long time. Some people leave the pitch, and some carry the pitch with them for life. Beckham is the latter. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the hidden corners behind the spotlight that not everyone has the courage to face. Even from a very young age, David Beckham grew up in a typical working-class English family, where life wasn't abundant, but was always anchored by discipline, responsibility, and unspoken rules. The Beckham home wasn't a place for vague dreams. Everything had to have a purpose, and football soon became the biggest purpose. His father, a man who loved football almost to the point of obsession, carried Manchester United in his heart, like part of his identity. That love wasn't loud or affectionate. It showed in taking his son to the park in freezing cold, in repetitive training sessions, in the eyes watching every touch of the ball. For Beckham, football wasn't just a game. It was the only language to connect with his father. Recognition there didn't come from hugs or praise, but from a nod, a rare look of satisfaction. Gradually, young David learned that love in that house didn't disappear, but it always came with conditions. Play well and you're seen, play poorly, and silence envelops everything. No one said it out loud, but Beckham felt it clearly. He learned to read his father's eyes, to spot disappointment in a single sigh, to ask himself every time he left the field, was I good enough today? In a family where achievement measured worth, Beckham early understood that failure wasn't just losing a match. It was disappointing the person he loved most. His childhood passed between training sessions, youth matches, and the feeling that he always had to try just a little harder, even when his legs were tired, even when his mind was exhausted. Beckham wasn't taught to show sadness or encouraged to voice fear. Instead, he was taught that enduring was natural, that silence was the right way forward. Gradually, a child's vulnerability was replaced by self-strictness. Beckham feared his father's disappointed look more than losing a game, feared feeling not good enough more than being dropped. That's where the original wound formed quietly but persistently, self-worth tied tightly to performance, to proving he deserved it. Young David grew up under expectations, not spoken aloud, but hanging in the air, always present, always heavy. It didn't break him, but it never left. It followed him into sleep, into every morning waking up, into every run later on. While other kids played football for fun, Beckham played for an invisible duty, for the deep fear that if he stopped, if he wasn't good enough, he'd lose the most precious thing: recognition. That childhood wasn't tragic in a loud way, no big shocks or dramatic events, but it left a long, deep mark. It was the childhood of a child who learned to brace himself too early, who learned to love by pleasing others, and who carried the sense that he only truly had value when he achieved something. That wound didn't bleed, wasn't named, but it was there, smoldering quietly, becoming the foundation for the rest of Beckham's life, where every success came with a silent fear that if he stopped trying, if he wasn't perfect anymore, the boy from back then would return, standing before his father's eyes, wondering if he was enough. As David Beckham grew a little older, football was no longer just where he sought approving looks. It gradually became an inescapable duty. The casual park kickabouts, which should have been full of joy and laughter, were replaced by fixed training schedules, repetitive running drills, and the sense that every passing minute had to produce results. Beckham no longer asked himself if he liked it, because that question soon became irrelevant. In the world he grew up in, quitting wasn't a valid option. It meant betraying expectations, betraying his family's efforts, and above all, betraying the image shaped for him from very early on. So Beckham kept going, not because of burning passion, but because stopping was unacceptable. His childhood was sliced up by early morning and late afternoon trainings, by weekends spent on the pitch instead of with friends, by the constant need to be more serious than his age allowed. While other kids could be lazy, change their minds, say they didn't want to anymore, Beckham couldn't. He learned to push fatigue aside, to hide boredom, and most importantly, to believe his value depended on whether he kept moving forward. Football slowly took over his entire living space, seeping into every small decision, every private thought, until there was no clear line between the person David and the player David. Discipline became the measure of morality. Endurance, a necessary virtue. Beckham wasn't taught to pause and listen to himself. He was taught to push past the urge to stop. That's where a subtle tragedy began to form. Young David didn't choose his dream in the usual sense. That dream had already been placed on his shoulders beforehand, heavy and impossible to remove. It chose him, shaped him, and demanded he repay it with all his time, energy, and youth. Beckham grew up faster than other kids, not because he was more mature, but because he had no other choice. He began to understand that tiredness wasn't a legitimate reason to stop, that personal feelings had to give way to collective discipline. Every time he stepped onto the field, he wasn't just playing for himself, but for the image everyone expected, for the pre-drawn dream. Deep down, there were moments he wondered if he was living his own life, but that question was quickly buried under the sound of the training whistle and the relentless rhythm that allowed no hesitation. Childhood, which should have been a time to make mistakes, to try, to change direction, was completely replaced by a straight path where every step was preset. Beckham wasn't forced by violence or threats, but guided by a sense of responsibility so heavy he couldn't turn back. It was a quiet tragedy, without immediate tears, a prolonged, silent trade-off where a child learned to live for someone else's dream before he could even figure out what his own dream was. And by the time he realized it, Beckham had gone too far to turn back, carrying a childhood compressed under discipline and a deep belief that the road ahead, no matter how hard, was the only one he was allowed to walk. Entering the Manchester United Academy wasn't like opening a door to a dream. It was like slamming shut the last door of childhood. David Beckham left home very early, carrying a small bag, a few clothes, and the belief that he wasn't allowed to fail. That moment had no tears of farewell, no long parting words, just the feeling that this was something that had to be done, whether he wanted it or not. Away from family, away from the familiar space, Beckham stepped into a world where everything was measured by the ability to survive. The academy didn't welcome dreamy kids. It only kept those tough enough to endure. There, talent was the prerequisite, but discipline and endurance were the real requirements. Every training session was a test, every match an elimination round, and every mistake could become a reason to be replaced. Beckham quickly understood that he wasn't just competing against opponents, but also against the very roommates and training mates whose faces were there today but could vanish forever tomorrow. No one said it out loud, but the culling was present in every glance, every quietly changing list. In that environment, there was no room for tears. Homesickness, fatigue, loneliness all had to be hidden. Beckham learned to stay silent when in pain, to nod when criticized, to blame himself before anyone else could. He didn't allow himself to complain, because complaining meant weakness, and weakness was something the academy didn't tolerate. Those nights, lying in the dormitory, when the noises had died down, Beckham faced a silence heavier than any physical drill. There was no family to lean on, no one asking if he was okay. Only one question echoed in his head. Am I good enough to stay? The motif of silence repeated day after day, week after week, season after season. Silence when criticized, silence when homesick, silence when his body ached. Enduring became a reflex, not a choice. Beckham gradually understood that to survive, he had to turn emotions into something controllable, had to pack fear up tightly and set it aside. He didn't complain, not because he had nothing to complain about, but because he feared that just one moment of letting go would cause everything to collapse. Childhood, which should have been built on gentle memories, was replaced by packed training schedules, fitness tests, and the constant feeling of being judged. Beckham had no time to remember that he was still just a kid. He was forced to act like an adult, to take responsibility for every small opportunity given. In that harshness, Beckham wasn't broken, but he wasn't whole anymore either. A piece of innocence was taken away, traded for a cold focus and an unwavering will. He learned to stand straight under pressure, to exist in an environment that didn't allow repeated mistakes. The Manchester United Academy didn't steal Beckham's dream, but it quietly took his childhood. Looking back, there wasn't one specific moment to call a loss, just the sense that those years that should have been light passed in silence and endurance. Beckham left that academy not only with sharpened football skills, but with a person accustomed to living under pressure, accustomed to bracing against hardship, and accustomed to believing that not complaining was the only way to keep going. And it was from there that the boy stepped into the wider world, carrying a solid foundation, but also carrying a silent cut, where childhood had been taken away, in exchange for the right to stay in the dream he had never truly chosen. Stepping out of the academy and into Manchester United's first team, David Beckham had almost no buffer to prepare for the intense change waiting ahead. Everything happened too fast for him to even realize he had left the world of anonymous youth players and stepped into the center of a massive machine called fame. In a short time, the name Beckham appeared regularly in newspapers, on television, in fans' conversations. The boy used to the silence of the academy was now surrounded by stares, expectations, and judgments he had never experienced before. Success came when Beckham was still too young, before he had built a strong enough mental foundation to withstand the weight of attention. He still carried the habit of enduring, still believed silence was the best way forward, But the outside world didn't operate by that logic. In the first team, every run was analyzed, every touch scrutinized, and every mistake, no matter how small, could be blown up into a big story. Beckham quickly understood that he was no longer allowed to fail like before, no longer allowed to learn in the shadows. Every error now had an audience, had voices, had people ready to label him. The pressure didn't just come from the pitch, it came from having to exist in a public image being built too fast, too soon. Beckham kept doing what he had known since childhood, training harder, being stricter with discipline, and putting more responsibility on his own shoulders than necessary. But no one told him that success didn't just require skill, and it also required the ability to protect yourself from the cruelty of the spotlight. No one taught Beckham how to face being praised today and doubted tomorrow. No one prepared him for the imbalance when a compliment could lift him high, but a negative article could drag him down deep. Beckham learned football very well, but no one taught him how to survive fame. He didn't know what to do with the cheers, didn't know how to react to criticism. Instead of seeking help, he chose to brace himself harder, because that was the only thing he knew. Every match became a test, not just of technique, but of handling pressure. Beckham began to feel clearly that he was no longer judged as a young player learning, but as an icon being shaped. His mental immaturity made him vulnerable to emotional swings, but he didn't allow himself to admit it. In an environment where a strong image was the standard, vulnerability was seen as weakness. So Beckham kept moving forward, kept making his mark, kept proving his worth, while inside, he was still a young man trying to figure out what was happening to his life. Success brought opportunities, but also a price Beckham had never been warned about. He began living with the feeling that every eye was waiting for a mistake, that every step could be interpreted in the worst possible way. Fame didn't give him time to adjust, didn't give him space to grow slowly. It pushed him into a role bigger than his real self, and demanded he play it perfectly. Beckham managed it through discipline and focus, but each time, he traded away another piece of peace. The message of this period isn't in the goals or the moments of glory, it's in the truth that no one taught Beckham how to survive fame. He had to learn it himself, endure it himself, and grow up himself while the whole world watched. And it was during that time that the first cracks formed quietly but deeply, laying the foundation for the mental tragedies that would emerge later, when pressure was no longer just a challenge, but a lifelong burden. The summer of 1998 came to David Beckham not like a football tournament, but like a prearranged trial, where he stepped in as the defendant without even knowing it. The World Cup should have been the dream of every young player, the pinnacle of honor that an entire career aims for. But for Beckham, it became the moment when every fragile mental foundation he had was completely crushed. When the red card was shown in the match against Argentina, time seemed to freeze in a brief breath. It was just a momentary outburst, an immature reflex from a 23-year-old who hadn't yet finished learning the lesson of the global stage's harshness. But the world didn't see it that way. In a few seconds, Beckham was no longer the promising young player, no longer the new hope of English football. He became the symbol of failure, the face representing the collective anger the entire country was looking for a place to unleash. When the England team was eliminated, the fury didn't target tactics, didn't target the system, it poured straight onto one single name: Beckham. The English press, notorious for its cruelty, turned that moment into a sentence that lasted for years. Sensational headlines called him a traitor, a scapegoat, the man who had sold out the nation's dream. Images of Beckham, torn apart on front pages, blackened with venomous words, appeared so densely there was no room left for sympathy. No one asked how he felt. No one reminded anyone that he was still just a young man. The whole country needed someone to hate, and Beckham was chosen. The sense of collapse came faster and more violently than any sporting failure he had ever experienced. On the pitch, he was used to pressure. used to scrutiny, but he had never faced nationwide hatred. Beckham left the World Cup not just with a player's disappointment at being knocked out, but with the feeling that an entire community had turned its back on him. The training sessions afterward were no longer places to improve himself, they were places where he had to face suspicious looks and heavy silence. Boos rang out from the stands, not from opponents, but from the very people who once cheered his name. Every touch of the ball, every set-piece situation, brought mocking whistles as a reminder that he hadn't been forgiven. The loneliness enveloped Beckham in a very different way. Before, loneliness came from discipline and self-pressure, but this time it came from the feeling of being stripped of the right to belong. He was no longer one of us. He was the one who ruined everything. Panic crept into the most ordinary moments. Beckham began to fear going out on the street, fear strangers' eyes, fear offhand words that could become the next attack. His family wasn't spared from that storm either. Threatening letters, malicious calls, hateful words aimed at his loved ones turned the home that was once a refuge into something fragile. Beckham's parents lived in constant unease, not knowing what would come next, not knowing where the hatred would stop. For a boy who grew up under family expectations, watching his own family dragged into that vortex was a pain hard to name. Beckham didn't just feel guilty toward the team, he felt he had brought danger to those he loved most. In sleepless nights, he faced a question more terrifying than any article. Did he still deserve to step onto the pitch? No one had prepared Beckham to face such a public collapse. There was no class teaching how to stand firm when an entire nation turns its back. Beckham had nowhere to hide because judgmental eyes were everywhere. He couldn't go back to being an anonymous player, nor could he disappear. Every step was watched. Every appearance brought back that fateful moment. The panic didn't explode into screams, it settled into a prolonged state of tension where he was always on defense, always afraid that one more mistake would make everything collapse completely. The most painful thing wasn't the criticism, it was the cold silence from those who once saw him as a source of pride. Beckham learned that public love can flip in an instant, that admiration always comes with conditions, and when those conditions aren't met, it turns into ruthless hatred. The 1998 World Cup became the deepest cut in Beckham's soul, not because of the red card, but because of the feeling of being stripped of the right to make mistakes. He had made a mistake, but the price he paid went far beyond any reasonable limit. In the months that followed, Beckham didn't try to justify himself, didn't speak out in protest. He chose silence because silence was the only survival skill he had learned since childhood. But this silence didn't bring peace. It only made the pain sink deeper, heavier. Beckham kept going, kept playing, kept appearing in public, but inside was a young man trying to pick up the pieces of himself. The 1998 World Cup didn't end when the tournament closed. It followed Beckham home, followed him into every match, every training session, every restless sleep. It was the moment when football stopped being just a game or a career and became the real source of fear. And it was from here that Beckham understood a cruel truth. Some failures don't just make you lose. They steal your sense of safety, your sense of belonging, and leave a panic that lingers long after the final whistle has blown. After the 1998 World Cup, David Beckham didn't return to England as a failed player, looking for redemption. He returned like a defendant temporarily released on bail, walking among stares of hatred that hadn't softened at all. Every Premier League match was no longer simply 90 minutes of football. It became an extended trial, where the verdict was already written and only waiting for a new mistake to be read aloud. When Beckham stepped onto the pitch, the boos didn't come from opponents. They came from the very stands that once chanted his name with pride, banners carrying insults, whistles every time he touched the ball, mocking laughter when he mishandled a situation, all combined into an invisible but crushing wall. Beckham understood very clearly that he no longer had the right to make any more mistakes. One more error wouldn't just mean losing a match. It would confirm what the crowd already believed, that he didn't deserve it. In that atmosphere, every decision on the field carried far more weight than it should. Beckham no longer played with the freedom of youth, but with the caution of someone always afraid of being convicted. He ran, passed, shot with the awareness that every action was being weighed, every moment could become evidence against him. That pressure didn't vanish after the final whistle. It followed him to the locker room, home, into long evenings where silence grew thicker than ever. Beckham didn't fight back, didn't respond to the press, didn't try to explain or justify. He returned to the only thing he had known since childhood: silence. Silence became his survival mechanism, a thin armor that helped him stand against the storm of public opinion. Say nothing so things don't get worse. Show no emotion, so he isn't seen as weak. Don't complain, so he isn't seen as a victim. But silence didn't erase the feeling of being hunted. It only pushed the fear inward, where no one could see it, but it was always present. Beckham began living in a state of prolonged tension, where every time he stepped out was a psychological test harsher than any physical drill. He knew that just one moment of lost focus, one bad pass, one wayward shot, and everything would go back to square one. There was no room for vulnerability, no time to heal. The whole system seemed to wait for him to collapse again to prove the first time wasn't an accident. In those circumstances, Beckham found no comfort from the crowd. He had to build a private inner world to survive. He focused on what he could control: training more, stricter discipline, more thorough preparation. Football became the only place he could prove his worth, but also the only place that could continue to hurt him. Living under hateful stares, Beckham gradually lost the sense of safety a young player needs to develop naturally. Every goal he scored was no longer pure joy. It was temporary relief. Every match that passed wasn't a victory. It was survival for another day. He learned to suppress reactions, to keep a calm face even under the heaviest attacks. From afar, people might see a cold, focused, professional player, but inside was a man bracing himself every day to keep from breaking. Beckham understood he was being tested not just on skill, but on his ability to endure isolation. The crowd didn't give him a chance to start over. They only accepted perfection or total failure. In that environment, silence was no longer a choice. It was the condition for survival. Beckham didn't speak, but every run he made was a response. He didn't argue back, but every time he got up after the boos was a quiet act of resistance. Living under hateful stares, Beckham didn't try to change the world around him. He learned to change himself, to endure it. And it was during this period, when every eye waited for him to fall, that something else began to form very slowly. The mental toughness of a man who had understood that, if he couldn't be loved, he at least had to be strong enough not to be crushed. David Beckham's comeback didn't arrive with instant cheers. It came through a slow, exhausting, and highly vigilant process. After years of living under hateful stares, every step he took on the pitch felt like walking on thin ice, where even a tiny slip could pull everything crashing back down. But Beckham kept moving forward, not with the impulsiveness of youth, but with the caution of someone who understood the true cost of a mistake very clearly. Through each match, each season, he gradually regained the respect he had lost, not through words or public apologies, but through cold consistency and unwavering responsibility. When the England national team captain's armband was handed to Beckham, it wasn't just an honor. It was a belated acknowledgement that he had endured long enough, paid enough of a price. Captain Beckham was no longer the emotional young man of 1998. He stepped onto the pitch with a calm demeanor, a face that showed little expression, and eyes that always seemed to weigh the worst possibilities before considering anything good. Respect returned, but it didn't erase the old memories. Every round of applause carried a layer of caution, as if Beckham was always wondering whether it could disappear at any moment. He didn't allow himself to fully trust the public's forgiveness because he had seen how quickly it could flip. Becoming captain meant carrying even more responsibility. But for Beckham, that responsibility carried a different meaning. It wasn't just about leading teammates. It was about keeping himself from slipping again. He lived in constant vigilance, where every decision was carefully weighed, where personal emotions were pushed back to make room for control. Beckham no longer played by natural instinct, but by an internal discipline system built from fear. This comeback, therefore, didn't have the shape of a fairy tale. It was a scarred recovery, where success didn't bring complete release, it only brought a fragile state of balance. Beckham was respected again, but he never felt completely safe. Every time he wore the national team jersey, every time he stepped onto Wembley, the memory of 1998 was still there, like a reminder that everything could collapse in an instant. The only difference now was that Beckham had learned to live with that fear. He was no longer the child craving recognition. He was a man who understood that respect had to be guarded every single day. Captain Beckham spoke less, smiled less, and rarely let his true emotions show. Those watching from the outside saw a calm, reliable leader, but inside was a man constantly reminding himself not to let his guard down. Returning to the top didn't bring Beckham a complete sense of victory, because the price paid had been too high. He had learned the lesson that public affection always comes with conditions, and therefore he could never put his entire self into it. Beckham kept moving forward, carrying the captain's armband and new expectations on his shoulders, but also carrying an emptiness that could never be filled. The child who once played football to make his father proud, who once dreamed of the pitch with simple joy, was gone. In his place was a man forged by criticism, failure, and the harshness of public opinion. Beckham's comeback was real, but it didn't take him back to the starting point. It took him to a different version of himself, stronger, more controlled, but also more closed off. And in the respect he regained, there was always a thin layer of vigilance, reminding him that the past never fully disappears. Beckham continued to live, continued to lead, but deep inside, he knew very clearly he would never again be the carefree kid who stepped onto the pitch all those years ago. When David Beckham left England to wear the white of Real Madrid, it wasn't just a football transfer, it was a fateful turning point in how the world saw him. Real Madrid during the Galácticos era wasn't an ordinary team. It was a global stage where great individuals were magnified until the line between person and icon disappeared. Beckham stepped into that not just as a winger, but as a fully formed brand. His hair, his face, his demeanor, every detail was dissected, copied, and replicated by the media. His name appeared on billboards, magazine covers, sponsorship deals, and campaigns that went far beyond sports. In that world, Beckham no longer had the right to be ordinary. He couldn't step onto the pitch just to play football, couldn't walk down the street just for a stroll, couldn't exist as an anonymous man in a crowd. The Galácticos turned him into a global icon, but also locked him in a cage of glory with no way out. At the Bernabeu, every pass Beckham made carried unimaginable expectations. He didn't just have to play well, he had to live up to the image that Real Madrid and the world had invested in. Every mistake was magnified, every quiet match seen as a betrayal of that image. Beckham understood very clearly that he was no longer judged purely as a footballer. He was compared, doubted, questioned, not just on his performance but on his very reason for being in the lineup. In a locker room full of stars, Beckham still felt lonely in a very specific way. He could stand among Zidane, Ronaldo, Figo, but still carry the feeling that he was living in a pre-written role. Football at Real Madrid was no longer a place for release. It was part of a non-stop image machine. Beckham kept doing what he had known his whole life, staying silent, disciplined, enduring. He trained harder, more professionally, trying to prove he wasn't just a pretty face or a commercial contract. But every effort only reinforced the invisible cage around him. The more perfect he became, the more trapped he was in expectations that could never be lowered. No one asked Beckham if he was tired, if he felt pressure, if he still recognized himself in the mirror. They only saw an icon that always had to be perfect, always shining, always ready to represent everything. His private life was stretched to the breaking point. His family became the focus of scrutiny. Every ordinary moment turned into news. Beckham no longer had space to fail quietly, no room for moments of weakness. At Real Madrid, he lived in a state of constant observation, where personal freedom was traded for global glory. The feeling of being trapped didn't come from violence or force. It came from the very excess of admiration. Beckham realized that no matter how bright the spotlight, it had a dark side. It didn't allow you to step outside the pre-constructed image. He became an icon, but lost the right to be an ordinary person with contradictions, fatigue, and limits. Real Madrid brought Beckham the peak of fame, but also pushed him further from any sense of belonging. In the dazzling white jersey, he kept playing, kept contributing, but inside was a man growing more and more closed off. The Galácticos didn't destroy Beckham, but it locked him tightly in a role he couldn't remove. And it was right there, amid the brightest lights in Europe, that Beckham began to understand that freedom doesn't lie in being admired. It lies in the right to live as himself, a right he had lost long ago. David Beckham's marriage to Victoria didn't take place in the privacy that most couples enjoy, but under the microscope of global media, where every gesture was magnified and every silence interpreted in the most unfavorable way. When they came together, it was the collision of two rising icons, two worlds of fame crashing into each other and instantly becoming the center of attention. Their love didn't belong only to them. It was pulled into the current of public opinion, where people didn't ask how they felt, but only cared about the image they projected. From the very beginning, that marriage carried an invisible burden. It always had to prove it was real, that it was strong enough to survive under unrelenting pressure. Beckham entered family life while he was still learning how to survive under the lights, while Victoria brought the experience of a star accustomed to merciless scrutiny. Those two famous people loved each other, but they also had to learn how to protect each other from a world always waiting for their breakup. Every transfer, every geographic change, every different phase of their careers created distances that were hard to see from the outside. Rumors appeared as an inevitable part of public life. Repeating so often they became background noise. But for those inside, they were small scratches accumulating day by day. Beckham and Victoria didn't break in one dramatic moment. They were worn down slowly by the lack of privacy, by the constant need to be on defense, by never being allowed to show fatigue in public. They learned to stay silent when doubted, learned to stand side by side in front of cameras, even when everything inside was shaking. Their love wasn't nurtured by ordinary quiet moments, but by continuous patience and compromise. Beckham, used to enduring, carried that habit into marriage, choosing to protect his family through silence and discipline. Victoria, strong in her own way, also had to learn to live with their private life being torn apart into headlines. The two of them had no right to fade from the world's gaze, no right to resolve conflicts in the dark. Every public appearance was a test. Were they still standing together? The tragedy of this marriage wasn't in a breakup. It was in how rarely it was ever allowed to rest. Their love was placed in a state of constant proof, forced to endure questions no couple should have to answer. Beckham and Victoria gradually understood that to not lose each other, they had to accept losing some of their personal freedom. Private moments became rare, and that very rarity forced them to value each other in a quieter way. They didn't defeat public opinion, nor could they completely silence the rumors, but they chose to exist day by day, phase by phase, as a quiet act of resistance. Media pressure didn't disappear over the years. It only changed shape, and each time it tested their bond again. Beckham carried both his career and his family image on his shoulders, while Victoria had to balance herself and her role as a wife under the lights. Those two people weren't perfect, weren't immune to hurt, but they learned to stand beside each other even when they no longer had the strength to explain. Their marriage, therefore, wasn't a fairy tale. It was a prolonged process of endurance, where love didn't burn brightly, but smoldered steadily and persistently. It didn't break in front of the world, but it was worn down day by scrutiny, by expectations, and by the cost of living a life that was never truly private. And it was in that very wearing down that Beckham and Victoria understood what kept them together wasn't a perfect image, but the choice to keep staying, even when no one saw the efforts behind the lights. As the years of his peak gradually faded into the past, David Beckham's body began to speak in ways his iron will could no longer command into silence. It wasn't one single, clear, dramatic injury, but a chain of small damages accumulated over the years, smoldering and persistent, like a debt postponed for too long. The tackles, the sprints, the thousands of repeated shots had left their marks on his knees, back, ankles, parts of the body that once served him loyally, but now demanded payment. Mornings no longer began with eagerness to hit the pitch, but with stiffness the moment his feet touched the ground, with a few minutes standing still for his body to adjust to itself. The pain didn't come like a blow. It came as a steady reminder that time had changed direction. Beckham still kept his habit of discipline, still trained, still cared for himself with familiar strictness, but he recognized a hard truth. The mind could command forward, but the body couldn't always follow. Those prolonged, painful mornings didn't just wear down his strength, they wore down his sense of control, the thing that had helped him survive the harshest periods. His body betrayed his iron will in a very quiet way, without noise, without giving him time to prepare mentally. Some days, even bending to tie his shoes became a challenge. Some nights, the pain pulled him out of sleep, leaving a long silence where he faced himself. Beckham wasn't used to having to ask his body for permission for simple movements. He had once been used to pushing past limits, to seeing pain as part of the job, but now pain was no longer a conquerable challenge. It was a reality to accept. That shift was harder than any big match. It forced him to admit that some things couldn't be won by will alone. In those moments, Beckham faced a fear deeper than any injury, the fear of becoming dependent, the fear of no longer being the strong version the world was used to seeing. He had spent his whole life not allowing himself weakness, not showing limits, but now his body no longer followed those old rules. Recovery exercises, treatment sessions became part of a new routine, reminding him that time didn't just take speed and endurance, it took the illusion of invincibility. Beckham didn't resent his body, but he also couldn't deny the feeling of betrayal. Every ache was a living memory, reminding him of the years traded for glory. In silence, he learned to listen to his body, a skill he had never needed in his youth. That listening didn't bring instant relief, but it opened a different way of existing, slower, more cautious, and more honest. His body began calling in the debt not to punish but to balance. It forced Beckham to face the truth that no victory came free and every glory left its trace. The painful mornings became a new ritual, where he warmed up not just his joints but his mind too. Beckham no longer ran from the pain, nor did he try to deny it. He carried it as part of his life's story, not dramatically, not complaining, but not hiding it either. His body could betray his iron will, but it also taught him a belated lesson. Real strength isn't just in enduring. It's in knowing when to slow down, when to care for what has served you your whole life. When David Beckham became a father, his life moved into a completely different chapter, not loud like the pitch, but heavier in a deeply quiet way. He loved his children with a gentleness the world rarely saw in someone who had lived his entire life in discipline and control. The moments with his kids, from drop-offs and pickups, playing together, to quiet family evenings, gave Beckham a feeling he had never truly had before. The feeling of being in the right role without needing to prove anything. But alongside that deep love was a smoldering, persistent fear that never left. Beckham feared that he might unintentionally repeat what had shaped his own childhood. He feared that the strictness, expectations, and silence he grew up with would unconsciously pass to the next generation. Becoming a father made Beckham look back at his relationship with his own father through different eyes. He understood more about the pressures and limits of a man from the previous generation, but that understanding didn't erase the memory of always needing to be good enough to be recognized. That was why, every time he looked into his children's eyes, Beckham didn't just see love, he saw the heavy responsibility to do things differently. He didn't want his kids to grow up feeling their worth depended on achievements or perfection. But the fear of passing on patterns isn't easily erased. It crept into the most ordinary moments, when he wondered if he had spent enough time, when he worried his busyness would make him absent during important times, when he feared the image of the famous father might overshadow his real self in his children's eyes. Beckham loved his children, but he also feared that love might not be enough to protect them from the pressures he himself had endured. He tried to be more present, to listen more, to show emotions more than what he had witnessed as a child. But every effort came with a silent question. Is this enough? The fear wasn't that he didn't love them. It was that he loved them so much, he was afraid of getting it wrong. Beckham understood no father is perfect, but that very understanding made him stricter with himself. He didn't want to become an image his children had to please at all costs. He wanted to be the place they could return to when they failed, when they were weak. But to do that, Beckham had to face his own unhealed wounds. Fatherhood forced him to look straight at the fear of generational patterns, the fear that old molds would repeat if not consciously healed. In the silence of family life, Beckham learned to love unconditionally, but he also learned to accept that he would never be completely certain he was doing it right. Perhaps that very unease, that constant self-questioning, was the clearest sign he was trying to be a different kind of father from what he had experienced. And in that effort, Beckham wasn't seeking perfection. He was seeking real presence. Something simple but harder than any title he ever won on the pitch. When David Beckham officially left the pitch, no final whistle was loud enough to truly mark the end. No more training schedules, no more locker rooms, no more mornings defined by the clear goal of preparing for the next match. The silence came slowly, but when it arrived, it covered everything. Beckham had spent almost his entire adult life becoming a football player, existing in a role that was always clearly defined. When that role disappeared, he faced an emptiness that couldn't be filled with trophies or memories. Leaving the pitch wasn't just stopping playing. It was losing an identity that had seeped into every habit, every rhythm of life. Beckham woke up without knowing exactly who he was supposed to be that day. He was still called a legend, still appeared in the media. But those things couldn't replace the feeling of belonging to a team, to a shared goal. That emptiness didn't show itself through panic or public breakdown, but through a quiet sense of being adrift. Beckham realized that without football, he had to relearn how to exist without the roar of the crowd as background noise. The first days after retirement passed slowly, without the pressure of competition, but also without the familiar motivation to hold on to. He had once been defined by form, by results, by his position on the field. Now those measures vanished, leaving a hard question. If I'm no longer a player, then who am I? Beckham tried to fill the emptiness with projects and new roles, but the sense of loss remained. Not because he lacked things to do, but because he lacked the sense of necessity, the feeling that his presence mattered right then and there. On the pitch, every action had a clear purpose. Off the pitch, purpose became vaguer, and that very vagueness made Beckham uneasy. He was no longer measured by minutes played or accurate shots, but by more abstract, harder-to-grasp standards. The unfillable emptiness wasn't just an emptiness of time, it was an emptiness of identity. Beckham began to understand that for many years he had tied his self-worth tightly to his role as a player, and when that role vanished, that worth wavered too. No one had prepared him for this, just as no one had ever taught him how to let go of an identity that had sustained him for so long. He learned to accept the drifting, to sit still with uncertainty, a skill completely foreign to someone who had lived in strict discipline. Some days, Beckham missed the pitch, not for the glory, but for the clarity it brought. He missed the feeling of knowing exactly what he needed to do to be considered good enough. After retirement, there were no longer such simple rules. Every choice was open, but that openness itself was overwhelming. Beckham was no longer forced to run, to shoot, to fight, but he also no longer had a place to channel all the energy built up over years. That emptiness didn't disappear with time, it only changed shape. Beckham gradually learned to live with it instead of trying to fill it. He accepted that losing an identity didn't mean losing worth, but to understand that, he had to go through a long period of emptiness. After retirement, Beckham didn't collapse, but he also didn't find immediate peace. He stood between a glorious past and an unclear future, carrying the feeling that a part of himself had vanished with those final matches. And it was in that unfillable emptiness that Beckham began another journey not loud, without stadiums, where the biggest challenge wasn't an opponent, but learning to accept himself without the role that had defined his entire life. After leaving the pitch, David Beckham didn't disappear, but he also no longer stood at the center of the spotlight as before. Getting involved in building Inter Miami didn't have the feel of a grand comeback. It felt like a quiet choice from a man who understood all too well the cost of always being seen. Here, Beckham was no longer cheered every weekend, no longer had direct roars for every touch. He stood in the background, in long meetings, exhausting negotiations, decisions without an audience. Inter Miami wasn't a team handed instant success. It was a young, fragile project where every mistake could bring criticism and every progress came very slowly. Beckham stepped into this role with a patience rarely seen in someone who had spent his life in the fast pace of elite competition. He didn't build the team impulsively, but with the experience of someone who had paid dearly for every lack of preparation. But in that process, loneliness returned in a different form. If before it came from being hated or misunderstood, now it came from working in silence, where results weren't measured by applause, but by the persistence of time. Beckham was no longer the one being honored. He was the one who had to take responsibility. Every decision on personnel, strategy, direction carried his personal stamp, and therefore his personal risk. There was no one to share that burden in public. Beckham chose to stand behind the lights, but the price of that choice was the feeling of rarely being directly recognized. He built instead of being celebrated, accepting that true legacy doesn't always come with instant admiration. In the modern football world, where everything happens fast and loud, patiently building a foundation is a countercurrent act. Beckham understood that Inter Miami wasn't a place to reclaim old glory, but a place to transform his years of solitude into something with lasting meaning. He didn't need to be the most visible face in the media, because he had lived in that state for too long. Instead, he chose quiet presence, a kind of leadership without show. But that quietness also meant accepting the feeling of being disconnected from the excitement football once brought. There were no longer instant release moments, only slow, sometimes uncertain results. Beckham built his legacy in solitude, because he understood that what lasts is rarely created in noise. Inter Miami became the place where he redefined his relationship with football, not based on personal achievements anymore, but on long-term responsibility. He wasn't seeking praise, he was seeking the feeling that he was contributing to something bigger than himself. But even in this role, Beckham didn't completely escape the sense of being adrift. He remained someone standing between two worlds, A glorious past everyone remembers, and a quiet present few truly understand. A legacy built on solitude isn't romantic. It's necessary for Beckham to keep moving forward without returning to his old self. He no longer needed to prove who he was on the pitch, but he still had to face the question of what he wanted to leave behind. And in that question, Beckham chose to build, to be patient, to accept that sometimes the only way to create real value is to step back from the lights and work in silence. His legacy, therefore, isn't loud or explosive. It's built day by day, decision by small decision, in the solitude of a man who had gone too far to go back seeking mere cheers. At the end of this journey, David Beckham doesn't stand before the world as a victor who has just found the final answer to his life. He stands there as a man who has gone too far to still believe in neat, complete endings. After everything he has been through: glory, collapse, forgiveness, betrayal, love, and loss, Beckham understands that some pains don't disappear just because time passes or because a person has become strong enough. They stay, quietly, as part of his structure. There is no moment of complete healing, no clear line between before and after, only a continuing reality, having to keep living with what cannot be erased. Beckham once believed that if he tried hard enough, if his discipline was strict enough, if he endured long enough, everything would eventually be okay. But at some point, he realized that willpower doesn't always defeat memory. The mornings when his body aches, the sudden silences when old memories return, the questions that are never fully answered, they are all still there. The only difference now is that he no longer runs from them. He doesn't deny them, doesn't hide them, doesn't try to turn them into easily digestible inspirational stories. Beckham learned to name his limits correctly, to accept that he has been shaped by wounds that cannot be completely removed. That doesn't make him weaker, but it also doesn't turn him into an untouchable icon. It makes him more honest with himself, honest in admitting that that great career was built on a foundation of prolonged pressure, of a compressed childhood, of moments when the whole world turned its back. Honest in understanding that family love, no matter how deep, cannot erase old scars. Honest in accepting that there are still nights when he lies awake, still thinking, still feeling he isn't enough. With no pitch left to escape into, no packed schedule to numb his thoughts, Beckham faces himself in the most stripped-down state, and right there, no final victory waits, no trophy to place over the pain and call it done, only the repeated choice every day, to keep living, to keep showing up, to keep not running away. Beckham no longer seeks to prove anything to the world. He also doesn't try to fix the past. He understands that the past isn't something to repair, it's something to carry. What he can do is decide how he carries it. Instead of bracing against the pain, he lets it exist as part of his story. Not beautiful, not romantic, but real. Beckham lives more slowly, more cautiously, and with fewer expectations that one day everything will be okay. He no longer believes in promises of salvation, because he has seen too many people collapse when they believed that just a little more effort would bring release. Instead, he chooses presence. Presence with his family, with projects built through patience, with the body that has served him his whole life. That presence doesn't erase the pain, but it stops the pain from controlling every decision. In the way Beckham walks at this age, there is no longer the eagerness of youth, nor the tension of someone always having to prove himself, only a calm paid for with many years. He doesn't talk much about what was lost, nor does he embellish what remains. He lets life happen, with all its imperfection, and it is that very imperfection that makes his story more worth reflecting on than any legend. Because Beckham is not proof that a person can overcome every tragedy. He is proof that a person can keep living even when the tragedy never leaves. Not fully healed, not ultimately victorious, only honesty with himself, and the courage not to turn his back on the most painful parts of who he is. David Beckham didn't overcome tragedy. He just learned not to run from it. Looking back at the entire story of David Beckham, what lingers most painfully isn't the titles he won, but the quiet price he paid to deserve them. From a boy growing up in a working-class English family, learning to read his father's eyes to know if he was good enough yet, Beckham carried the original wound that self-worth was tied to achievement. That wound didn't disappear when he became a star. It was only covered by discipline and silence. The 1998 World Cup was the central tragic moment of the story, when a single mistake caused an entire country to turn its back, turning a 23-year-old into a publicly hated figure. The way Beckham chose silence, endurance, and to keep stepping onto the pitch in the years that followed shows a kind of courage society rarely celebrates, the courage to survive. When he returned as England captain, then stepped into Real Madrid as a global icon, respect came back, but true freedom never did. The spotlight became a cage. His marriage to Victoria worn down day by day under media scrutiny, and his body began calling in debts with unavoidable mourning pains. After retirement, the identity void revealed a bitter truth. Society is very good at cheering, but rarely teaches people how to live when the lights go out. For American audiences, the lesson from Beckham isn't about overcoming everything, but about honesty with pain. He isn't fully healed. There is no final victory, but he chose not to run. In a culture that glorifies success and mandatory positivity, this story reminds us that human worth isn't only in achievements, it's in the ability to keep living decently and responsibly even when wounds never disappear. Thank you for staying until the end of this painful and honest story. If you value imperfect but very real journeys like David Beckham's, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us. See you in the next video, where we'll continue listening to the stories behind the spotlight that not every legend has the courage to tell.